everyone, and I'm Maria Luisa Pino. I am a BACC Southeast board member and a graduate research assistant at the Center of International Business at Georgia State University, and we are very glad that you had the chance and opportunity to join us today. We would like also to thank the CIBER from Georgia State University. As a member of the chamber, it's providing us with the technological support we need for this event, but we also want to thank you, all of you, for joining us. We have also online Ambassador Nestor Foster and Ambassador Carlos Enrique de Abreu. They will be introduced shortly. So just using the Zoom, let's say, webinar lingo. So those are our panelists together with Lucia Jennings, BACC founder, chairwoman of BACC Southeast. And we have also Hannah Tripp, managing director of the CIBER here with us. So before we start, just a few things to go through. Okay, so all the participants, you are unmuted. So if you need to talk to us, you have the alternative to use the chat, or if you want to pose some questions, you can pose on a Q&A, okay? So some of those buttons you can see here. So if you were on the desktop or you are on the iPad, you just slide your mouse, you know, at the bottom, and you probably will see those buttons, okay? You can chat with the panelists at all times, but ideally you should pose your questions on the Q&A, okay? And if you have any particular topic, I will be answering you after the introductions. So if you need to contact us, oh, sorry, you have the colors. I give you here the contacts of Lucia, because this is a webinar being organized with the GSU-CIBER, but also with the BACC Southeast. So our main contact is Lucia, and please, when you finish participate in the webinar, there's a little survey that you're going to be connected. And we really appreciate if you can answer, so we have some feedback. Something important that I forgot to mention is we are recording this webinar, and we will share with you when we finish in a few days. We will share you online. We want to thank also not only CIBER, but all our members, the chamber sponsors. They are the ones allowing us, supporting the efforts from the chamber to continue the efforts bridging Brazil and the region of Southeast and United States. So we would like also to invite you to our next event. So we have an interesting agenda. So next week, we are going to talk about the international business in times of pandemic. Again, we are going to talk about Brazil with our dear ambassador, but also other stakeholders around the topic. So we have two professors, one from United States and one from Brazil. And we have also Rosemary Stasio as another stakeholder supporting small and medium entrepreneurs and how they're going internationally. So it's going to be next Wednesday, June 10th. And another webinar organized by the BACC is the new normal under life after the COVID, the new normal. So the MJV Innovation have been doing research how it's going to be. They have already 2 waves available on their website, and we will have the chance to take a look on how it has been and how it's going to be our future. So without any further ado, I will pass the baton to my friend Lucia Jennings, that she will introduce our panelists.
Thanks, Maria Luisa, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to participate in today's Brazil briefing with the distinguished guest, Ambassador Nestor Foster, Brazil's ambassador to the United States. Our special thanks to Georgia State Cyber and the support of the Consulate of Brazil in Atlanta for making this event possible. Before we introduce Ambassador Forster and start our program, I would like to make a disclaimer that the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce of the Southeast does not have a political opinion. Our mission is to serve the interests of our business community by fostering opportunities for trade and investments between Brazil and the Southeast United States. I would like to invite our Consul General of Brazil in Atlanta, Ambassador Carlos Henrique de Abreu, to do the honors of formally introducing Ambassador Nestor Foster. Ambassador Carlos Henrique de Abreu, who most of you know him, is a career diplomat who assumed the post of Consul General at the Consulate General of Brazil in Atlanta in December of 2018, after serving as Consul General of Brazil in Sydney, Australia. Before that, he served as the Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of Brazil in Washington, and at one point he was the Director of the Department of United States, Canada, and Inter-American Affairs at the Ministry of External Relations. Certainly that he has many more important roles on his resume, but I will make it short in respect of time. So please, Ambassador Carlos Henrique, introduce Ambassador Nestor Foster, and afterwards I will start our conversation.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Lucia and Maria Teresa, for your kind introduction. Well, for me, it's an honor, really, and a pleasure to introduce Ambassador Nestor Foster Jr. He's our new ambassador to Washington, to the United States of America. He has been a career diplomat now for 34 years. He has held many important positions in the Brazilian government, back in Brasilia, including at the presidency twice. And abroad, he was posted to 3 countries, United States, Canada, and Costa Rica. But he served 5 times in the United States. 3 times at our embassy in Washington, once in our consulate in New York, and once in our consulate in Hartford, Connecticut. I think it's a record. I think really he's the Brazilian diplomat who has served most times in the United States. And Ambassador Foster has led many Brazilian delegations to bilateral, regional, and multilateral meetings. He's one of the finest and most knowledgeable and experienced Brazilian diplomats, in particular regarding the United States and the relations between Brazil and the United States. So he's the right man at the right place. And I had the honor really to work together with him at our embassy in Washington some time ago. And next to a great man, there is always a great woman, Maria Teresa, his wife. She's the Deputy Consul General in Washington, D.C. Well, without any further delay, I would invite him to take the floor. Thank you, Nestor, and please let's give him a big round of applause.
I hope he can hear us.
Thank you.
Ambassador Foster, thank you so much for participating in today's Brazil briefing. I want to start by asking you about the U.S.-Brazil relationship. In March of 2019, in his first bilateral visit abroad after assuming office, President Bolsonaro met in Washington, D.C. with President Trump. President Bolsonaro was joined by 7 of his 22 ministers, including Economy Minister Paulo Guedes, then Justice Minister Sérgio Moro, and Foreign Affairs Minister Ernesto Araújo. The visit defined a new chapter for U.S.-Brazil relations, with a written joint statement between the two countries that prioritize expanding cooperation in trade and FDI, defense and security, and innovation. Here we are, a little more than a year later. What are the recent developments of this joint statement?
Thank you very much, Lucia Jennings. Let me just start by thanking you, BACC Southeast, for organizing this event. I want to thank my colleague and friend, Ambassador Carlos Henrique de Abreu, our Consul General in Atlanta, for those very kind remarks introducing me. It's a pleasure to be here. If you allow me, I'll only begin with a little complaint. I would like to be there in person instead of, virtually, so I could, see Atlanta City that I had the privilege to know. I had a brief stint there at our Consul General a while ago, and it's a beautiful city. I'm very fond of Atlanta, of the warmth which the Georgians receive people from outside. I have very good memories from there. I hope we can one day, perhaps soon, do this live. Let me jump back to your question. You put it very well. There was a turning point last year when President Bolsonaro came here, March 2019, his first major trip abroad. And as a result of the tremendous level of convergence, let's say, of understanding that we have between President Bolsonaro and President Trump, many initiatives came to fruition. Back then, we had the designation of Brazil as a major non-NATO ally, which has important implications for the defense industry and for increased cooperation between our military. So that was one concrete result back then. We also had the US coming out with a strong support for Brazil's accession to the OECD, which is something very important for our agenda of reforms. I'll comment more on that later. We also signed a very important agreement, Technological Safeguards Agreement, which will enable American companies to use the base we have in northeastern Brazil, in your home state of Maranhão, there in Alcântara, which people say it's the best place in the world to launch a satellite, because you can launch it, east, west, and north, south, at 2 degrees of the equator. It's really a privileged place. The good news about that is that, the agreement has been approved by our Congress. They did a tremendous job there, speed tracking this through the chamber and then through the Senate. And now we have American companies already lining up to use the facilities there and be the first one to launch a satellite. But that's all, that's all been done. Since then, we have, opened new avenues of cooperation, trying to increase this tremendous relationship, which is based on one side, the more evident aspect of our bilateral relationship is the relation between the two heads of state. No question about that. But that does not come in a void. We have a very long history. And I always, I know we're here to talk about the present and take a look into the future, but I also like to highlight 1 or 2 points about our past, because that enables us to understand better what's going on and what we intend to do going forward. So one thing that very few people realize, that Brazil and the United States have the longest standing relationship of, that Brazil has with any other country. It started almost 200 years ago in 1923, barely 1 year into our independence. And, it was never broken, never interrupted. We had, closer moments, warmer moments, cooler moments. And the moment we're living right now is a special moment, because it will enable us to bring forward all these elements that we share in terms of values and principles. I'm talking about the respect for the rule of law, for human rights, individual freedoms, freedom of religion, and so on and so forth, which, we treasure dearly in Brazil, and of course, Americans do the same here. So it's against that background of shared principles, shared values, that the intense relationship between the two heads of state acquire a special meaning and enable us to go forward with new initiatives. I mentioned things we have done. What are we doing now? We had, another important March meeting last March 7th. There was this big, I'd say historic working dinner between our two presidents. I was honored to be there to witness, the whole conversation and the understanding and the level of understanding that the two men have, and the things that they decided to do going forward. That's reflected to a large extent, of course, in the communique, in the joint communique that was issued. And one of the things I think that has perhaps more interest for the members of the chamber was the very high goal that both presidents set for our trade and economic relationship. I think if I remember correctly, the language they use is that, you know, Brazil and the US had agreed to achieve a meaningful trade and economic understanding pact by the end of the year. What has been done about that, and you know, what's concrete about it going forward? So this was March 7th, and then we had the COVID pandemics kicking in. I had the very dubious honor of being a pioneer in that regard. I got it, you know, in early March, right after Mar-a-Lago. Fortunately, you know, it lasted only a week, and I had mild symptoms. You know, other people have it more seriously, unfortunately. But I had mild symptoms, and we moved forward. But you know, it dawned on me that we had this big challenge ahead of us of a very special, historic moment in our bilateral relationship, and then we have a pandemic going on. So what do we do to keep that energy moving forward? What do we do to keep the momentum of our agenda? And you know, almost 3 months later, I'm happy to report that to a large extent we have succeeded in doing just so. You know, the amount of meetings we've had like this, you know, virtually, it's you know, I cannot mention all of them, but we have very meaningful meetings basically in 3 different areas which support this trade and economic agenda. One is we had a preparation for the CEO Forum. I think you're familiar with that. It's an initiative that gathers together, you know, 10 big CEOs from big companies from both sides, and they get together usually once a year, and they set the agenda very much with the input of organizations like yours, you know, from the chambers of commerce from around the country, and private sector, individual companies, bringing on their concerns, their views, their suggestions on how to move forward. So we had already a meeting a couple of weeks ago preparing the 2nd edition of the CEO Forum, which is going to take place in Brazil in the 2nd semester. So that's one thing that's moving forward nicely. We also have been having ongoing conversations under the auspices of the so-called Agreement on Trade and Economic Cooperation, ATEC short. And it's under the umbrella of ATEC that we are talking about issues like trade facilitation, e-commerce, good regulatory practices, a couple of other issues. I can, you know, elaborate more on that if you're interested further down, not to bore you too much with my initial talk here. But then we have another major event. We had an edition of our commercial dialogue just 2 weeks ago. And that was something very impressive because we were able to gather 100 you know, senior officials from both countries, from the US and from Brazil. On the Brazilian side, from the Ministry of the Economy, from the Foreign Affairs, but also from several regulatory agencies in Brazil, Inmetro, Denatran, etc. On the American side, same thing here. The Department of Commerce was leading with a State Department, with several other agencies that are, you know, NIST and others that are involved in these conversations. And we are able to produce tremendous results in terms of, you know, how close we are in approving, you know, some sort of common rules for areas, these non-tariff areas, regulatory areas, which will enable us to remove barriers to trade, simplify the way we trade with each other, reducing costs, streamlining, cutting red tape, and you know, making Brazil more competitive in a way. And so I'm impressed with what we've been able to say. It's not the embassy, it's, you know, the Brazilian government, the American government, private sector. Without the private sector support, we will not go forward with this agenda. This is absolutely fundamental for our effort. So in a very general way, what I'd say is that, you know, we have ongoing talks with very high goals, which were set by our presidents, and the agenda is moving forward as never before. And we have also a host of other initiatives in other areas, you know, which I can elaborate further down on, for instance, on you know, science and technology cooperation, aerospace cooperation. We have ongoing dialogue on health and everything that has to do with the pandemics. There's been also tremendous level of understanding and cooperation in this very critical juncture. What did I mention? I mentioned at the outset, the defense and military cooperation has been going forward. Right after Mar-a-Lago, we signed a follow-up agreement it's a research and development agreement that will enable our military and our defense industries to work together in joint projects. This is also groundbreaking. The US has only this with 14 countries in the world, and Brazil is the first Latin American country to have this sort of agreement. So, we have many initiatives. It's a broad agenda, and I'm very pleased to report that it's going forward in a very meaningful way, and doing justice to what I said, to the amount of commonalities of shared history and shared principles that the US and Brazil have as the two largest democracies in the Western Hemisphere. I'll stop here, and I'll gladly take any questions you might have, and if there are specific points from what I touched upon that you'd like me to elaborate, I'm ready to do so. Again, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you today.
Well, thank you. There is no denying that the United States and Brazil are key partners and allies. I go to my next question, which is, since President Jair Bolsonaro took office and he appointed Paulo Guedes, and you mentioned expectations were that red tape would be reduced, the tax system would be updated, and that there would be administrative reform of the state. How likely will these changes occur during this government?
The agenda, look, Lucia, the agenda is there. Let's take a brief look, what happened in this past year. We were able to approve the public pension system reform, which was something that, Brazilian governments have been trying to do for the past 30 years, and we succeeded. And I mentioned that not to look back, but to look forward, because it was by bringing public accounts into some sort of, rational control, let's put it that way. This reform enabled the federal government to be in a much stronger position to take the fiscal measures that we are taking now to fight the pandemic. So this is a vital reform. It went through. There's a second reform that already went through, which people pay little attention to, and I think it's of paramount importance, which is the so-called Economic Freedom Act, or Law of Economic Freedom, which establishes a host of principles which, are somewhat new to Brazilian culture. Again, cutting red tape, promoting trust in the citizen, in the consumer, in a way expanding the rights of the citizen, as a consumer, as a taxpayer, in its relations with the state. So it's basically, a law aimed at reducing the size of the state and empowering individuals, which is, has a very democratic air to it. This has been done. What's ahead of us? What's the agenda looking forward? We have the tax reform before Congress. This is of, fundamental importance for everyone who does business in Brazil. I'll quote Minister Paulo Guedes himself recently when he was asked about where are the reforms going in Brazil, is this going anywhere with the pandemics and the situation, etc. And he said something which, is going to come through fruition, which is this: the pandemic is not an excuse for us to do less or to procrastinate. Much to the contrary, it's an incentive for us to accelerate the process of reforms. Considering all the economic challenges before us because of the slowdown of, economic slowdown around the world, it's not only in Brazil, this is going to be very tough consequences, including social consequences, economic consequences. This will hurt employment levels, economic activity, etc. It's already happening. To react to that, we need more reform. We need to move faster with what's before Congress. You mentioned the administrative reform. That's also part of that. The bills are in Congress. I think there is, from what I hear from the leadership in Congress, they're ready to push this forward now in the second semester and try to get it done before the end of the year. It's very much in Brazil's interest to do so. Again, if I can just try to bring things together, all this effort in reforms, it brings a degree of alignment between the Brazilian government, the private sector, both in Brazil and here in the United States, and with the American government, that is totally unprecedented. As Ambassador Carlos Henrique mentioned, I served here in the United States several times, My first posting was in Washington back in '92. And so I've seen many administrations, many moments of our relationship, moments when you expected that, things would move forward faster and they didn't, and, synergies to happen and they didn't come to fruition. And right now, we have the broad agenda, we have the vision. It's a big challenge for all of us to give concrete form to that, but it goes along with the reforms that we're trying to do domestically, okay? What we want to do with the US. As it also goes along with, Brazil's accession to the OECD, a process we're hopeful we can start soon. We have the full support of the United States government with us, which is very important as the largest member of the OECD. But then again, that will bring more momentum to the reform process. And it's very much what we intend to do, open up our country. There's another element. The agreement we just wrapped up last year with the European Union, which is, the single largest trade agreement in history in terms of the GDP, the populations, the number of countries involved. By any way you look at it, it's really huge. And, once it goes through Congress, it's, it comes into force, it will be a tremendous incentive for increasing Brazilian competitiveness, reducing red tape, reducing the cost of doing business in Brazil. Just to wrap up, the biggest reform, there's a friend who works with Minister Oecd who likes to say this, and I like to repeat it because I think it's true. It's that, the most important trade agreement that Brazil can negotiate, it's not with the European Union, it's not with the United States, is with Brazil itself. We need to eliminate red tape and reduce the cost of doing business, of investing and doing business in Brazil. And, all these factors are coming together in a very positive synergy to work towards that goal.
We definitely want to see more of that. Have we lost Ambassador?
Me?
Okay. No? Yeah, we want to see more of the FDI going back into Brazil. We saw a lot of funding leaving Brazil, but you spoke about this slow economic recovery around the world. And in your point of view, will Brazil be experience a V, a W, or U-shaped economic recovery?
We all hope for a V. That's all we want. I don't have a crystal ball to see the future, how it's going to play out. There are some indications, though. That there are industries that have been globally hurt. Like, for instance, the transportation travel industry has been hurt, has been reduced some 90% in terms of flights around the world, consumption of fuel, etc. 90%. That's a big hit. The tourism industry, the hospitality industry, hotels, restaurants, etc., all took a big hit. The expectation is that, of course, this is all temporary, and then we're going to come back. And there are good signs. I'll mention two of them. One, Brazil's agricultural sector continues to grow. And Brazil is poised to harvest the largest agricultural harvest in grains ever, 250 million tons of grains are said. It's going to be a record-breaking harvest this year again, amidst the pandemic. So this shows the resilience of the agricultural sector, the agribusiness sector in Brazil. So that's one good sign. The other one, the second one I would like to mention is among the G20 countries, Brazil, according to data that's just been released a couple of days ago, Brazil was one of the countries that were hurt the least in terms of foreign trade. The contraction of our foreign trade was very little, and was the country that had the least contraction among the G20 countries. So showing again resilience of our foreign trade, which is also an important element for the recovery. We're doing what we can. I think from the economic point of view, we took very bold and early measures. The central bank in Brazil, for instance, was one of the institutions that provided, a tremendous shock of liquidity to the economy to a tune that's not been matched, I think, by any other country. The Ministry of the Economy has worked on fiscal measures, extending the collection of taxes, increasing tax exemptions, and providing direct access for the most vulnerable in our society to cash transfers, increasing the social database that the government had. There were people, Minister Oecd called them the unseen, You know, people who would not show up in the database or in statistics or anywhere else. The government was able to dig those people. You know, we're talking about 20 million Brazilians who had access to nothing. And, you know, they're getting a check from the government as a temporary help during this very hard situation. This whole effort, led by the Ministry of the Economy, actually, you know, won high praise during the IMF World Bank meetings, you know, which this year were virtual just a month ago. But, you know, praised because it's very effective in terms of getting to those who need most. And that's another thing, if you allow me to just go into the pandemics itself and the way it was fought in Brazil. There was some misunderstandings and perhaps misrepresentation of what President Bolsonaro intended to do. And he basically had two ideas about how to fight this. Number one, considering the size of Brazil and how regionally diverse our country is, it's very hard to have a one-size-fits-all solution on how to fight the pandemic. You know, you cannot have the same approach in the Amazon as you have in São Paulo, as you have in the south, as you have in the wetlands in the heart of Brazil. I mean, it's a very, very diverse country in many ways. So no one size fits all, let's adjust to local realities. That was one thing. Second thing, the pandemic is mainly and above all a public health emergency. And this aspect is fundamental, needs to be tackled head on. But this is not, it's not all the aspects of the pandemic. We have the social and economic impact of it. And what President Bolsonaro was saying is, look, we have to take an integrated approach and fight all these fronts at the same time. We cannot concentrate on one and forget the other, we'll lose the battle. Okay? So the approach, let's say this holistic approach, has been there from the outset. And then if I can mention just something that's very similar to what happened to some extent here in the United States. Brazil is a large country as the US, and we're also a federation, meaning, you know, there are things that state governors and local authorities are responsible for doing. In the case of the measures in the health sector, the federal government, the Ministry of Health, is responsible for doing the transfer of resources, you know, tax monies, etc., so that the governors at the local level can take the measures, use that money to fight the pandemic. The federal government, the Ministry of Health, sets guidelines, but it does not enforce guidelines, or it cannot micromanage, you know, how much social distancing or how long does the lockdown has to last, etc., in different states. That's up to individual states. And that's a wise thing, because, you know, you see that Brazil, many states did the right thing and have very low death rates and, you know, a very good result in fighting the pandemic, because you need this, you know, to differentiate treat differently situations that are different. So that's, I would say, it's a, you know, overall thing on fighting the pandemic. And as I said, it was an integrated approach. While the Ministry of Health was, you know, providing money, it's distributing more than 10 million tests already around the country. The Ministry of the Economy was providing this, you know, tax breaks, tax incentives, etc., which are, it's important to underline that, are seen as something of a wartime effort, as something exceptional, extraordinary. This does not represent any backtracking from the commitment we have with the reform process, with fiscal responsibility, with opening markets, and so on.
I will. Thank you so much. And now I would see if there are any questions from the audience.
Yes, one question that maybe it will be interesting if Ambassador can explore a little bit more is about this opportunities that maybe Brazil, that US business are not fully using, that Brazil presents, and what do you perceptions, what might be holding them that they not really fully explore?
Excellent question. Well, one thing that, you know, does not represent a stimulus for FDI, for foreign investment in Brazil, is the amount of bureaucracy and red tape, you know, regulatory excesses and inefficiencies, which are somewhat built in our system. You know, we don't get a very good rating in terms of the ease of doing business in Brazil. This has improved over the past year or so. This act I mentioned, the Law of Economic Freedom, had a tremendous impact in specifically at that point And then we have the pandemic, of course, which does not act immediately as an incentive for more investment. But if you look at, in terms, in aggregate terms, the trade between Brazil and the United States, last year was something like around $105 billion. We see a tremendous potential in increasing that. If you look at the trade the U.S. has with Mexico, of course, you have a free trade agreement with Mexico, next door neighbor, etc. But Mexico is a much smaller economy than Brazil, and has a trade that's almost 6 times, around $600 billion with the United States. So, we can only go one way, and that is growth. And my good friend, Ambassador Todd Chapman, the American ambassador to Brazil, who has brought a high degree of enthusiasm pushing forward this tremendous agenda of cooperation. He has said something recently which I entirely subscribe. He said that, you look into the trade figures and you see the enormous potential. And he said, we should have set an ambitious goal of doubling our bilateral trade in 5 years. Doubling. It's not out of reach. It's not unrealistic at all. And I only would like to add that we should make a similar effort in the investment front. Let's double investment both ways if possible. If you look at the Brazilian investment in the United States, for instance, and many members of this chamber here represent that investment has grown 350% over the past decade. So we more than tripled it over 10 years. So this is something feasible and feasible both ways. As Brazil proceeds with the reform process, as we open up our economy, lower tariffs across the board, as we've been doing, and remove the non-tariff barriers, which sometimes act as a terrible deterrent, even worse than tariffs themselves.
Thank you very much. Yes, I believe that truly that we still have a lot of opportunities in both sides. And as you said about the investments, it would be interesting also to see the Brazilian investments in US, if you can tell a little bit what Trevor, for example, said about the investments in the southern region, bringing more than 100 millions in new factories. I know you are much broader perspective than necessarily on the South, but there's a lot of investments coming from Brazil and US. So can you talk a little bit about that?
I can. Look, I was taking a look into the excellent material that is prepared for our conversation here by our Consulate General. The team there did a tremendous job. And I was looking, they had information state by state of all the states that are members of BCC Southeast. And I was, almost surprised to see there is an important presence of Brazilian companies in every single state. You have the big companies, you have Gerdau, you have Embraer, you have WEG, you have Copersucar, you have not very traditional, not very well-known companies which are there doing a fantastic job. In terms of opportunities, I'd say that one thing that we need to take a closer look is at a growing integration in our agribusinesses. I think we should try to think outside the box in that area. Look, many people have said for many years, and this goes back in time, perhaps decades, that Brazil and the US would never be able to come very close in terms of a trade agreement because they compete a lot, specifically in the agricultural sector, which is, for most countries, it's always a very sensitive sector. So there's always these sorts of special regime for this product or that product, etc. Now, Brazil and the US, in each one in their own right, it's a powerhouse in terms of agriculture, of producing, grains, protein, etc. We together feed more than half of the world. So I see tremendous potential for an increased cooperation between our agribusinesses in terms of trying to promote the opening up of third markets, looking for opportunities that will benefit industries on both countries. The second thing, and this is something that we are to some extent already doing, is promoting science-based agriculture. So as we know what we're talking about when we have some barriers and don't erect them merely for protectionist reasons, as we see in some parts of the globe. There's room for, I'd say, even integration of the companies themselves, of seeking new opportunities together for fusions, mergers, etc., profiting from the fact that the U.S. has a vocation and is very specialized in a more temperate climate agriculture, whereas Brazil has become very efficient in a tropical agriculture. And that's been a work of many years of investment and research done by a Brazilian company called Embrapa, and of course by a very, very dynamic private sector. The other day I was just seeing something which impressed me in a presentation, that the level of the use of digital technology in Brazilian agriculture in some aspects is higher than in the United States, which is wow, you know. So we're talking about very efficient operations, which are in a position, of course, to compete anywhere in the world, but which are, also would benefit tremendously of, you know, further investment and association with the United States. We've seen that in some sectors. You know, the presence of JBS, I think, is in some of the states of the chamber there. You know, in the meat industry, the beef industry. But the fact is that, you know, together Brazil and the United States are the #1 and #2 producer of, you know, beef, pork, poultry, soybeans, you know, you name it. we just alternate between being #1 and #2. So I think, considering all that, that should be seen as a tremendous incentive to increase our cooperation, our investment, our cross investment in this very, very fundamental sector of our economies. I mean, there's more than that. We've been working together, as I mentioned, the defense industry, Embraer, which is present in several states. They have an important manufacturing plant in Jacksonville, in Florida, which I had the privilege to visit during the President Bolsonaro's visit to Florida. And they manufactured an incredible aircraft there, a light attack aircraft called the Super Tucán, the A-29. And you know, it's something that's been sold to 30 countries and has a tremendous record, being tested in battle, etc. And it's one demonstration, one clear example of Brazilian and American technology coming together, you know, and delivering a fantastic product, which is praised, you know, by all those who were familiar with the industry. We had many examples of those, you know, in the financial section and others. But what we can agree on is, you know, whatever is already going on, the potential to keep doing it and to move forward is there. And we as governments, we should get out of the way, you know, cut the red tape, reduce the bureaucracy, etc., eliminate corruption as much as we can to zero, as Brazil has been doing, you know, for these past few years with great success. And you know, let the private sector do its magic and bring forth economic opportunity, investment, create jobs, which is what we need badly to bring Brazilians, you know, upwards socially.
Yes, I think there's a lot of potential, and yes, there's a lot of potential also to make better, right, the process in both sides, right? We have also another question, and I'm trying to select a few of the questions that I think the ambassador can help us a lot, although we have some curiosity about the Chinese, how is going to be the relation. So I don't know how the ambassador feels to answer this kind of, so you let me know, because I know it's not your main focus, right? Your main focus is on the bilateral relations between United States and Brazil.
There is one question here, Maria Luisa, may I interrupt? Which
yes,
is
of course.
Could you please elaborate a little on the timeline for aerospace companies interested on the Alcântara base? When do you think the first launch will be? Have the companies display interest in having an assembly base there as well? We do have a pretty important university here, Georgia Tech, which has a aerospace degree. So I'm sure there's a lot of connection there with potential investments, I would say.
Wonderful. Excellent questions. Let me tackle Alcântara first, and then I'll speak a little bit about China as much as I can. In terms of the timeline, so we signed the Technological Safeguards Agreement last year. It came into force early 2020 now, this year. And we have several American companies which have already shown interest. And, you know, they come, whoever is interested in this can come to the embassy, the trade promotion section at our embassy, or at the consulate, which also has a very dynamic trade promotion section there in Atlanta. And we'll put you in contact with the Brazilian Space Agency. They're handling all the contracts, and, you know, they're guiding the process. There are things that need to be done, adjusted, you know, commitments that need to be made in terms of protection of intellectual property, etc. It's more of a, again, regulatory thing that needs to be done on the outset. The expectation, I'd say, is that, you know, the first launch can occur 1.5 to 2 years away. That's what we're listening, what we're hearing. The thing that they see in our country is a great vocation for what they call, you know, nano satellites, which have small payloads and can be launched very fast. So there's a tremendous potential to be explored, for instance, for environmental uses, for monitoring, you know, fires in the Amazon, or monitoring pollution, like the one very often we had in the northeastern Brazil last year, which, you know, brought oil to some of our most beautiful beaches, which was a very sad environmental thing. That causes, you know, we don't know exactly what happened. There are suspicions that it was some illegal activity involved. And, but anyway, it was an environmental crime. You know, if we have this Alcantara base running this small satellites, this is something we could do in 48 hours. We put a small satellite which will be focused on that very area of the ocean and will enable us to track what's going on, the movement of the oil, etc. So, I mean, this is just a simple example of the tremendous uses that can be made. The timeline, 1 to 2 years. I'm glad to hear about Georgia Tech, and if there is interest there in cooperation. We have universities in Brazil, and we have programs, ongoing programs of cooperation in this area. And somebody mentioned before about having the manufacturing plant installed in Brazil. That's something that we would very much welcome. And we have the resources. We have this big area close to São Paulo, in São José dos Campos, which is kind of the hub of the Brazilian aerospace industry. It's where Embraer was born, etc. And there are lots of you know, very exciting projects going on there, and we very much welcome more cooperation, including from Georgia Tech. Now, moving to the other side of the globe, yeah, it's not my area, but there's one thing that you know, we can say, which is this: China has a very important role to play. Any way you look at it in the world today, it's Brazil's #1 trading partner, okay, and has lots of investment in Brazil. The U.S. has you know, a larger stock and a more traditional presence in terms of investment than China has, but China is a significant player in that area as well. We welcome that. We don't want to disrupt those flows of trade. Brazil plays a very vital role for Chinese food safety. You know, we feed a good part of China, which buys a lot of our protein and soybeans, etc. And that trade has been growing, as our trade has been growing to other Asian countries. Okay, so that's one trend, and it's positive. You know, more trade, the better. Of course, you know, when we talk about the world, post-pandemic world, etc., there are all this discussion about the relocation, the rerouting of supply chains, of value chains. Some people perceive, you know, this comes from the American side. Some people here have been talking that perhaps there's an excessive dependency of some specific countries, some specific markets in terms of the origins of very, very critical resources for the US. I think that Brazil will be in a position to welcome whatever rerouting takes place, you know, because of the size of our economy, because of our proximity, and also because of what I said at the outset, because the values we share, the principles we share in terms of the rule of law, democracy, etc. And, you know, if you consider that Brazil has a very qualified workforce, you know, in many important sectors. And if we put together the process of reforms, the closer relationship in terms of trade and investment that we're building with the US, the coming into force of the agreement with the Europeans, OECD accession, etc., all those converge to the same goal. And that might act as, I think, you know, within the next year or so, as a big incentive for whoever is making investment decisions or, relocating investment to bring at least a good chunk of those investments to Brazil.
Thank you. There is one question that I'd like to ask is, what can we do better to improve the brand Brazil? We lost our efforts in saying that we are #1 in coffee. We lost our efforts in saying that all shoes are made in Brazil. So I wanted to just get your opinion. Is there any type of a positive marketing that can come from Brazil to help us, even as chambers of commerce that represent in one way or another the promotion of Brazil? How can we work together and improve this brand Brazil, the image that sometimes we feel is tarnished by issues that are unrelated to all the goods that could come from Brazil?
Excellent question. Look, we have, within the government, I think that the place to go to about this is Apex. You're familiar with the Apex, right?
Yeah.
So they are the ones, they have people working on this very topic, branding, the branding of the country, and so on. I recommend you speak with them. There are many ideas out there. There are things that we need to do and need to do better. I'd say that, this is something where the private sector has to lead, because the private sector has the resources, that, creativity, innovation capabilities to bring forth ideas that might help us in this area. To some extent, Brazil is a victim of its own success, because we are not a single product anymore. That you mentioned the coffee or the shoes, especially women's shoes and so on. The quality is still there. But Brazil exports, aircraft, and to the US we export mostly manufactured goods, which is very interesting. But we're also making inroads in non-traditional markets. For instance, Brazilian wines are getting better and better and winning prizes internationally. This is not very well known. Especially sparkling wines in Brazil are world class, and they're coming into the American market, etc. Sometimes, I'm not an expert in this field, but perhaps it's hard to find a unifying theme that will enable us to have one brand for everything that's done in the country. I'd say that perhaps the moment we live in, with the diversity of products and of competencies we have in Brazil, it might be wiser to do a sectoral approach or even a product-specific approach, which of course would be up to the private sector. But with Apex, we could do that. Now, if you allow me to elaborate in one point, there are things that are being said about Brazil, about those either who dislike Brazil or dislike President Bolsonaro and his administration, trying to tarnish our reputation in the environment or in other areas. Of course, it's our job here, part of my job here at the embassy, is to try to clarify those issues, not bringing political propaganda, I shy away of that. We want to discuss facts, public policies, in a very rational way. So just to give you an example, Brazil is an environmental powerhouse and will always be #1, okay? Not only because we have the largest rainforest in the world, but we also have the largest wetlands ecosystems in the Pantanal region, which is fantastic. Brazil has one of the largest coasts, sea coasts in the world, 8,500 kilometers of continuous coastal lines and so on. So that's one thing. But also Brazil has some sort of a heritage of working in environmental issues. Brazil have, our diplomacy in Itamaraty, we're very proud of the role we played in the 1990s when we had the United Nations Conference on the Environment in Rio in '92. That's when this concept of sustainable development was created. And we were a big part of that. And we have not gone astray from that concept at all. We actually still defend it very much. And if I just, not to be too long, but when we talk about the Amazon, people sometimes misunderstand what the president wants. President Bolsonaro has been clear. He wants to bring economic opportunity for the 25 million Brazilians who live in the Amazon and who have the worst indexes of human development anywhere in Brazil. They are some of the poorest Brazilians. Now, he wants to bring economic development, not at any cost. He wants to bring sustainable development. But that's, there are two aspects to that. And sometimes people who only care about the environment talk only about the sustainability part of it, as if we could, just shut down, fence the Amazon and make it a park for rich Europeans to come spend their vacations. We're not going to do that. Doesn't make sense. At the same time, nobody's going to set out to cut off, to destroy the forest. So we need, both things, the sustainability, the conservation, the respect for the environment and the forest on one side, and also economic opportunity, creating economic growth, jobs, opportunity for the Brazilians who live there. There are ways to do that. Technology allows us to do that. For instance, the Amazon soil is very, very rich in many, many different minerals, from gold to rare earths, you name it, we have it. And some of them are in indigenous reserves. And the indigenous populations are saying, look, there are sustainable ways to explore these minerals. Why not do it? So sometimes, this gets too much politicized and people say, oh, they want to destroy the Amazon. They want to invade the indigenous people's lands. When what we want to do is none of that, We just want to bring sustainable development to those who need it.
Well, thank you so much for clarifying. And Ambassador Carlos Henrique, we're about to close. Is that something you would like to ask, or can I just move and close the event? I leave it up to you just to say something if you feel like it.
Well, first of all, I think this discussion was very rich, and there's plenty of food for thought here. We have time to plan, and who knows, next year we can have a lot of activities, missions, and I truly hope to have Ambassador Nestor Foster coming to our region and to visit Atlanta, Georgia, as soon as possible. And we would really put together a great agenda program for you here. And it would be a landmark in the relationship between Brazil and this region of the United States. And when we talk about potential, the other day we were discussing, right, Nestor, for trade between Brazil and the United States. In the last 10 years, bilateral trade as a whole has increased by 30% in both directions, right? No, I'm sorry, Brazilian exports to the United States, a little more than 30%. But to this region of the United States, the growth was of 55%. So there's a great potential. Ambassador Nestor Foster, come visit us as soon as possible.
I will. Thank you so much. And the only condition I make for a visit is I need a reservation at Fogo de Chão.
Oh,
okay. Okay, we can manage that, right, Lucia?
for sure. Well, thank you, Ambassador Nestor Foster, for participating in today's discussion. We sincerely appreciate you and your role as representing our nation and our people in this country. We hope that you'll be able to schedule a visit to our region pretty soon, and it will be an honor to receive you in our city. Thanks, everyone, and I hope you will support the work that we do at the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce by becoming a member. So look us up at bacc-se.org or send me an email at luciajennings@bacc-se.org. And I wish everyone a great rest of the day. Thank you.
And thank you everybody for participating. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to answer all of your questions. Very interesting questions that came up, but we were a little bit short in time. And I'm sure Lucia and I will have the chance, maybe, why not structure something later, right, Lucia, to do like an update. How is everything going? So thank you, everyone. Thank you, ambassadors, the plural, Carlos and Nestor. Thank you, Lucia. Thank you for all the 67 people that were here with us. And thanks for the CIBER, of course, that, made this event possible. Please, when you leave the meeting, and make sure you answer our survey. And as soon as the record is available, we will share with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.